Now, the Queen was a great Christian, unafraid of being a Christian. Her Christmas messages always mentioned Jesus. And we've heard more about the church and God in the course of the last week than we normally do. Defender of the faith and all of those debates and arguments that you'll have heard with me over the last few days. What we haven't talked very much about are church buildings, other than the Abbey. Well, our studio guest is Eddie Tulesevich, if I've pronounced that.
That's quite right.
Oh, I've done all right there.
Yep,
good.
very good.
Good. Head of Communications for the National Churches Trust. So, as I say, we haven't talked much about church buildings, places of worship, places of history. You know, I know as I travel around this country, very often I'll stop and go in and look at a church because I want to see what's there and what its history is. But the Queen, of course, right from the moment of coronation, was involved with your organisation. I think Philip was involved as well. And I've got to tell you, in all sincerity, Eddie, I was unaware of all of this. So please, tell us the story of the royal couple and our places of worship.
Well, the year after the Queen was crowned, in 1953, the National Churches Trust was set up. We were then called the Historic Churches Preservation Trust, and all the great and the good were involved with our organisation. Winston Churchill was one of our trustees, the Governor of the Bank of England, and the Queen chose our charity to become the patron of. She inherited a number of patronages, but we were a new organisation, so for 69 years she was our patron. Wow. And that was a significant morale booster to churches up and down the country. As you said, there's a church in every village. There are several churches in every town. There are many churches in every city. They are the history of this country, back from the Saxons through to the Normans, through to the 20th century. People have been building churches. And the fact that the Queen and Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, took an active interest in our charity was a wonderful thing to happen to churches and to show their importance to people.
They're so important, and yet there hardly ever seems to be a church where there's not a sign outside about the fundraising target because the roof needs to be mended, or there's dry rot, or there's... I mean, it's a never-ending job to keep these churches effectively from falling into disrepair, isn't it?
It's a never-ending job, and as I said, there are 40,000 of them. The Church of England has got 16,000 alone. Most of those are listed buildings, so it costs a lot to repair them. So our job is to do things like fix the roof if it's leaking, if the spire's crumbling, we step in and try and do that, and also to pay for things like toilets and kitchens so that churches can be used for lots of purposes. And I think churches really sum up all the things that are great about Britain and also the things that the Queen took seriously. They are places of worship, or just a place to drop in for a moment's reflection, or as one of our vice presidents, Michael Palin, says, you just go there for a bit of peace and quiet. You can get away from the hurly-burly, and it doesn't cost you anything. Yeah. They're free to enter.
Well, you say that, but I mean, here we are sitting very close to Lambeth Palace, where the Archbishop of Canterbury presides, and yet to go into Canterbury Cathedral, or to go into Westminster Abbey. I think it's about 20 quid to go into Westminster Abbey.
It does, but the little parish churches, they're free.
No, I know.
So, you know,
I was teasing a bit.
The only one you have to pay for is St Bartholomew the Great in London. That's the only one that charges an admission fee. So they're great as places of worship or moments of reflection, or the word today is, you know, experience your spirituality, perhaps. They're also heritage, you know, as I said, going back to the Saxons, the Normans.
Yes, and tell us about the yew trees. There's so many. It seems the older the church, the more likely there is to be a yew tree.
Yes.
Often one that's been hollowed out. What's the story here?
So the story there is that yews were worshipped back in pre-Christian era by pagans. They were normally on a slightly bit of raised ground, so they're slightly higher up. And then when Christianity came here, they were in a sense used to build a church around. So that's why they're associated with churches. They were used sort of for pagan worship, and they're taken over by Christians, if I can put it that way.
And they're very old, these trees.
Very old, very old. And I mean, you know, the monarchy, you know, the Saxon kings are buried in a church in Kingston upon Thames in London. Obviously, Westminster Abbey is where a lot of the monarchs are buried. But, you know, the history of this nation is told through its churches.
I
agree.
And
the third thing that's really important I'm sure for the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, they're great centres for community. And that's, used for civic occasions. This weekend, people have been going to churches, perhaps signing books of condolence, lighting a candle. I'm sure there will be services, on the day of the funeral or the weekend before or the weekend after to mark that. But they're also used for all the sort of things that people need. I'm talking about things like food banks. They're going to be used for keeping people warm in the winter. So they bind the nation together in so many ways, and I think that's why they are important to the Queen.
Well, I mean, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, incredibly busy people, and obviously, they gave their patronage to lots and lots of charities. Were they able to be actively involved?
Certainly, for the first half of her reign, the Queen and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, came to our 50th anniversary about 15 years ago, and each year, we had a communication with the palace saying she'd read our latest annual review. She was very pleased to keep in touch. And just 5 years ago, she wrote a foreword for a book that we'd written about churches. And she mentioned the special nature of our work. It's a great morale booster to the public to know that the Queen's our patron, but also to the staff. And there are little things that boost staff morale because the staff got an invitation to a garden party once a year. So they felt connected to the Queen and to Prince Philip.
Well, I must say, I think it's very important. There are some churches, of course, that have fallen into disrepair. And whenever you see them, they make a very, very sad sight. Final quick thought. Wesley, Methodism, and in many parts of the country, you'll find church and chapel. It seems almost, well, maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems very few of those chapels are now places of worship. They've all sort of all been turned into homes or Wetherspoons pubs or... Have they almost disappeared, the chapels?
A lot of them have gone. We're a charity that supports churches and chapels of all denominations all around the UK. So we're, all Christian denominations we support. You're right, and that's partly because of the financial problems that smaller denominations like the Methodists have had. In Wales, in particular, independent chapels, they've been closing left, right and centre. Scotland, a lot of churches are going to close in the next few years. In England, closure has been, there have been fewer of them. And, we hope, certainly as a charity, as the National Churches Trust, that money is forthcoming from the government. The government has got a role to play in supporting those buildings. And so many people just who live near a church think it's worth saving. Chapels, you're right, they've been converted. They may also not have been as architecturally significant. They may only be 150 or 200 years old. They're important, but they're not Grade 1 heritage, which perhaps, Norman...
They're not going back 1,000 years and more. No,
that's the difference.
I completely understand. But when you see the sheer number of chapels around the country, you do realise that Wesley was an incredible phenomenon.
Well, indeed. But, I mean, there are Baptist chapels, Methodist chapels, there are so many different denominations. It's one of the strengths of this country that there are so many different Christian denominations.
Well, do you know what? It doesn't surprise me in the least that the Queen wanted this and believed in this, and thank you very, very much indeed for joining us, and thank you for the work that you do to preserve our history and our heritage. And talking of history, what a day today has been, hasn't it? Just truly remarkable to see the King walking in there into Parliament to address both houses, then to stand vigil at St Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh tonight. We are witnessing an extraordinary week, a week where history suddenly becomes real, where, as one of our messengers said earlier on, where suddenly we see what the constitutional monarchy actually is in action. It's real. It gives us a deeper and better understanding, actually, of who we are, what this country is, and what's unique about it. Now, coming up after me is